Mr Speaker, does the Minister agree that if the UK market is 4 times the size of the EU market of Scotland, it's very clear why businesses are saying loud and clearly that they don't want talk of another independence referendum, but instead want stability to strengthen the economy?
I quite agree with my honourable friend. SMEs in Scotland trade 4 times as much in the single market of the United Kingdom than they do with the European Union, and indeed they trade more with markets in the rest of the world than they do across the entire EU.
Murray. Thank you, Mr Speaker. One of the key things that the Scottish Government and the UK Government could do to take away uncertainty for SMEs and businesses across Scotland is to take off the table a second independence referendum. And one of the other things the Government could also do, and I hope we'll hear this in the autumn statement, is to conclude the Edinburgh City deal. So what discussions had you had with the Chancellor to make sure we'll hear that in the next few minutes?
Well, I share the enthusiasm for that City deal with the honourable gentleman. We will have to wait for another hour to hear more detail on that. But I could not agree with him more. The uncertainty in Scotland is coming far more from talk of another referendum than it is from the EU referendum outcome.
Bill Boswell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Yesterday it was announced that over 500 jobs in the Tannockside area of my constituency are under threat, as Ageas QuickFit Insurance have announced plans to axe their entire Scottish operation. If these plans proceed, it would be a devastating blow to the local community just before Christmas. What assistance can the Secretary of State for Scotland and his government provide for these constituents and families at this difficult time?
Obviously, this will be a very difficult time for the quick-fit workforce and their families at the moment, particularly, as the honourable gentleman mentions, in the run-up to Christmas. I understand quick-fit are consulting on closure by the end of March next year, and I hope the affected workers will be able to quickly move into alternative employment. The UK Government will assist with support from the Job Centre Plus Rapid Reaction Service, working also with North Lanarkshire Council to help all those being made redundant.
Speaker, given the importance of the exports to England from Scotland, what is my honourable friend's estimate of the number of jobs that are actually involved in this process? And doesn't that demonstrate the importance to Scotland and the economy of Scotland in staying in the United Kingdom?
Specifically to SMEs, which I'm sure the honourable gentleman intended to mention.
Well, the unemployment rate in Scotland is lower than that for the rest of the United Kingdom, and SMEs in Scotland, as my honourable friend points out, benefit from this trend as much as any other business in Scotland.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Speaker. On the 12th of October, in response to a question about the deal struck at Nissan, the Secretary of State stood at the dispatch box and said, and I quote, and I know you can probably quote it verbatim, Mr Speaker, whatever support is put in place for businesses in the north east of England will be put in place for Scotland. Is the Secretary of State or the Minister willing to confirm that this is still the case? And if so, will she provide us with more detail of this support? SMEs need to know.
My right honourable friend was exactly right in what he said about the Nissan deal. Indeed, that level of support will be available to Scottish businesses, but as for the detail, the right honourable gentleman will have to wait for another hour to hear the autumn statement for that.
Very, very grateful, especially for the promotion to the Privy Council. Can I say, in welcoming that commitment, and I'm sure that SMEs and businesses of all sizes will be reassured of it. However, in view of the commitment, there must have been an analysis of the costs. Will the Minister therefore inform the House what assessment has been made of the cost of this support?
My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, will be making an assessment of the costs and the benefits of all such deals on an ongoing basis.
Stephen Patterson.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State for Scotland has had numerous discussions with me about the intra-UK budget allocations under the Common Agricultural Policy. I've also had discussions on this issue with the National Farmers Union Scotland, Scottish Members of Parliament and the Scottish Government's Cabinet Secretary for Rural Economy and Connectivity.
Stephen Patterson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The convergence uplift is worth €230 million. The UK Government is withholding that money that should be supporting Scotland's rural economy. Scotland's farmers deserve fairness. When will Scotland's man in the Cabinet, and I refer to the Secretary of State for Scotland, do something about this? Will he continue to do nothing?
Well, I simply say to the honourable gentleman, we'll be giving an update on the review of CAP allocations before the end of this year. But I would also say this, the context has changed fundamentally following the decision to leave the EU. Some argue that the area-based payments, as required under the CAP, have never suited Scotland very well. Indeed, NFU Scotland have previously raised concerns about the level of payments going to very large landowners. And they've argued that we should instead direct support to farmers and producers through livestock payments. We have an opportunity now to look at all of these issues, and I'll be working closely with NFU Scotland and the talented team of officials there.
Callum Kerr.
Mr. Speaker, at this session, what we're really seeking in Scottish questions is the confirmation that the Scottish Secretary of State backs Scottish farmers and will get this promised money delivered. Now, it's fantastic that we have the Farming Minister here, but all we've had so far is no detail, just warm words to coin the Secretary of State. Can we have the detail? Will we have it in place and give Scottish farmers what they're entitled?
Well, I completely disagree with the honourable gentleman. As I made clear, the Secretary of State for Scotland discusses this issue with me regularly. I'm passionate about Scotland. I discuss this issue with NFU Scotland from January onwards, and we are working on joint proposals, joint agreements when it comes to post-Brexit agricultural policy.
Victoria Atkins.
Number 6, please, Mr. Speaker.
My right honourable friend has held 60 meetings with well over 100 Scottish organisations since the referendum to hear their views. In addition, my right honourable friend, the Business Secretary, has met businesses in Aberdeen, and the Trade Minister has met business leaders in Edinburgh.
Victoria Atkins.
Will my honourable friend encourage Scottish businesses to seize the opportunities of our new relationship with Europe and the wider world, including, of course, my own constituency of Louth and Horncastle, and will she urge the Scottish Government to support their businesses, stop moaning about referendums and get on with governing?
I thank my honourable friend, and I am happy to give that encouragement. The message the UK Government has heard loud and clear is that businesses in Scotland want stability and not another divisive referendum. Talk of independence is disruptive, and what people want now is the economic stability that can only be provided by Scotland remaining in the UK.
Stuart C. MacDonald.
Number 9, Mr. Speaker.
Spit it out, man. Come in on this question. Yours was similar.
Mr. Speaker, in July, the Secretary of State's party leader told the BBC, "I want to stay in the single market, even if a consequence of that is maintaining free movement of labour." Ruth Davidson was 100% correct. Can the Secretary of State explain the shoddy U-turn?
No U-turn on that whatsoever. The UK Government will seek the best possible deal for all parts of the United Kingdom, and that will include limits on free movement and the best possible access to and trade within the single market for British companies.
And C. Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The creative industries in Scotland are one of the most successful areas of Scottish business. There's real concern about the regulatory regime that Ofcom preside over and its future relationship with the European Union and what that actually looks like. What discussions has she had concerning that regulatory regime?
My ministerial colleagues in the Department for Culture, Media and Sport will have had discussions, and I will ask one of them to notify the honourable member of the outcome of those discussions.
Mr Carmichael.
Mr Speaker, in the Northern Isles, some of our most important exporting businesses are in the very successful food and drink sector. But they tell me that it is almost impossible for them to plan for their future until they know what access they will have to EU markets. Will the Minister ensure that their voices are heard in these negotiations, as well as the big boys in financial services and the automotive industries?
My right honourable friend, the DEFRA Minister, has regular meetings with the Scottish fishing industry and the agricultural sector, and across government there are many discussions with the Scottish Whisky Association about how they can continue to build on the strengths of their exports beyond the EU as well as within the single market.
Margaret Ferrier.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. During a live televised debate 2 days before Brexit vote, Scottish Tory leader Ruth Davidson said that the EU provides a level playing field for small businesses, and that if the UK were to leave the EU, the rest of the EU would impose tariffs and taxes. Can the Secretary of State please advise the House how many of the 1.2 million jobs provided by SMEs in Scotland he estimates to be at risk from these tariff and taxes once they come into force?
As I've said already, the government is committed to gaining the maximum access to the single market and trade within the single market for all British companies, and that includes Scottish SMEs.
Order. There's far too much noise in the chamber, a number of very loud private conversations. Let's have some order for a very senior and respected member of the House of 33 years standing, Sir David Amis.
Question number 7, Mr Speaker.
Mr Speaker, my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Scotland, held round tables with the Scottish food and drink industry in August and October. In addition, my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, met with a range of food and drink businesses during her visit to Scotland earlier this month.
Sir David Amis.
With Scotch whisky being the finest in the world and such a valuable export, would my honourable friend agree with me that as a result of the UK deciding to leave the European Union, there may be even further export opportunities?
I very much agree with my honourable friend, and the truth is that Scotch whisky is a fantastic success story for this country, with overseas sales worth $3.9 billion in 2015. Earlier this year I attended an event in Tokyo to promote great British drinks, and this included Scotch whisky, which is particularly popular in Japan.
Tasmina Ahmed Sheikh.
Mr Speaker, I wonder if the Secretary...
I don't think the Honourable Lady ever fully realised the extent of her own popularity on the government benches. Tasmina Ahmed Sheikh.
Does the Secretary of State for Scotland realise that the value of exports from the rest of the UK to Scotland are more than £50 billion? That is more than Scotland exports to the rest of the United Kingdom. So would the Secretary of State not agree that regardless of any constitutional arrangements that may come in the future, the Scotland-rest of UK trading relationship is indeed an important one to both parts of a constituent party? Where is it?
Well, I think the facts that the Honourable Lady highlights underlines the fact that the union that's really vital to this country is the United Kingdom, because we have very close trade between us there.
Ronald J. Wardener.
Number 8, sir.
Speaker, I have regular meetings with Scottish Government ministers, and I last met the Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Constitution at the Finance Quadrilateral on the 21st of October. Both governments are committed to providing all necessary support to the Scottish Fiscal Commission and Office of Budget Responsibility.
Does my right honourable friend agree that a core principle of stable, accountable, mature government must be that government should not fiddle its own forecast, but instead answer for its choices and their consequences to the people that they govern?
Mr. Speaker, I absolutely agree with my honourable friend, and the transfer of income tax and welfare powers to the Scottish Parliament does just that. No longer will the SNP and Scottish Government simply be able to complain. If they genuinely have ideas, they'll be able to do something about it, and the people of Scotland will understand what their tax implications are.
Finally, John Nicholson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, exports from the services sector could be cut by 60% if the UK is out of the single market. Now, that would be a 2.3 billion hit for Scotland. Given that, can he tell us why his Conservative colleagues at Holyrood voted against the Scottish Government's motion to protect Scotland's position?
With reference to the work of the Independent Fiscal Commission. Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that the Independent Fiscal Commission will have noted that my colleagues, the Conservative group in Holyrood, voted against the SNP's motion because we have absolutely no idea where the SNP stand in relation to the UK's future relationship with the EU.
Order. Questions to the Prime Minister. Mr. Peter Grant.
Number one, please, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Bairns Come First is a report recently produced by a number of organisations, including Fife Gingerbread and Citizens Advice and Rights Fife. It found that a third of families who should have been claiming child maintenance support did not apply, but a major barrier to application was a £20 application fee, and that the 4% collection fee had a serious impact on family budgets. Will the Prime Minister undertake to review these unfair charges?
The issues of trying to ensure that those who are responsible for children actually pay for their children when a family has broken up has been one that has been a long-standing question which this House has addressed. There have been various ways of dealing with it through the agency that has been responsible. I think it is right that the changes that have been introduced are on a more level basis and that more people are able to access the support that they need as a result.
Daniel Kaczynski.
The government is rightly focused on economic growth, jobs and prosperity, something that all of us on these benches can get behind. With that in mind, will she back our highly competitive bid for funding for the North West Relief Road in Shrewsbury, which will not only deal with the congestion our town is facing, but dovetail into that narrative?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for raising this? And I know that North West Relief Road in Shrewsbury has been an issue that is of particular concern to him. It's a priority for him, and it's received considerable local backing. I understand that the local marches, LEP has indeed put in a bid for feasibility funding so that they can prepare a business case for the scheme. What I can say at the moment is that the announcement of the successful bids for feasibility funding is expected very shortly indeed.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government's sustainability and transformation plans for the National Health Service hide £22 billion of cuts from our service, according to research by the BMA. That risks, and I quote, starving services of resources and patients of vital care. That comes from Dr. Mark Porter of the BMA. When he calls this process a mess, where is he wrong?
The National Health Service is indeed looking for savings within the NHS, which will be reinvested in the NHS. It is, and I would remind the right honourable gentleman that it is this government that is providing not just the £8 billion of extra funding the NHS requested, but £10 billion of extra funding requested by the National Health Service. And the sustainability and transformation plans are being developed at local level in the interests of local people by local clinicians.
It's very strange the Prime Minister should say that, Mr. Speaker, because the Health Select Committee, chaired by our honourable friend, the member for Totnes, says it's actually £4.5 billion, not £10 billion. There's quite a big difference there. And, Mr. Speaker, part of the reason for the strain on our National Health Service is that more than 1 million people are not receiving the social care that they need. As a result of this, there's been an increase in emergency admissions for older patients. Margaret wrote to me this week saying, "It's not funny." She described how her 89-year-old mother suffered 2 falls leading to hospital admissions due to the lack of nursing care, and went on to say, "My mother is worth more than this." What action will the Prime Minister take to stop the neglect of older people, which ends up in forcing them to take A&E admissions when they should be cared for at home or in a care home?
Well, of course, social care is an area of concern, and social care is a key issue for many people. That's why the government has introduced the Better Care Fund. That's why the government has introduced the social care precept for local authorities. And we're encouraging the working together of the health service and the local authorities to deal with precisely the issues he's raised on social care and bed blocking. But I will just say this to the right honourable gentleman. We've introduced the Better Care Fund and the social care precept. Let's just look at what Labour did in their 13 years. They said they'd deal with social care in the 97 manifesto, introduced a Royal Commission in 1999, a Green Paper in 2005, the Oneness Review in 2006, said they'd sorted in the CSR of 2007, and another Green Paper in 2009. 13 years and they did nothing.
Mr. Speaker, as the Prime Minister well knows, health spending trebled under the last Labour government. And the levels of satisfaction with the National Health Service were at their highest ever in 2010. This government's choice was to cut social care by £4.6 billion in the last Parliament, at the same time as they found the space, shall we say, to cut billions in corporate taxation bills. That means it's affecting patients leaving hospital as well. In the last 4 years, the number of patients unable to be transferred from hospital due to the lack of adequate social care has increased by 1/3. Will the Prime Minister ensure her government guarantees all of our elderly people the dignity they deserve?
I recognise the importance of caring for elderly people and providing them with the dignity that they deserve. He says that this government has done nothing on social care. I repeat, we've introduced the social care precept. That is being made use of by my local authorities and by his local authority. We've also introduced the Better Care Fund. But if he talks about support for elderly people, I would remind him, which government is it that has put the triple lock in place for pensioners, that's ensured the largest increase in pensions for elderly people?
The precept is a drop in the ocean compared to what's necessary for social care. And give you an example, Mr. Speaker, the whole House, I'm sure, would have been appalled by the revelations in BBC Panorama programme this week, showing older people systematically mistreated. The Care Quality Commission's assessment that care homes run by the Morley Group require improvement and has issued warning notices. The Commission goes on to say that the owner has allowed services to deteriorate further and has, and I quote, utterly neglected the duty of care to the residents of these homes. What action is her government going to take to protect the residents of those homes?
The right honourable gentleman raises the issue of the quality of care that is provided in homes and the way in which elderly people are treated. I'm sure everybody is appalled when we see examples of poor and terrible treatment that is given to elderly and vulnerable people in care homes. What we do about it is ensure that we have the CQC, which is able to step in, which takes action, which has powers to make sure that nobody in the chain of responsibility is immune from legal accountability. But we know that there's more that can be done, and that's why the CQC is looking into ways in which it can improve its processes, increase its efficiency. My honourable friend, the Minister for Community Health and Care, is going to be writing to the CQC shortly to look at how we can see to improve what they do. It's the CQC that deals with these issues. We have that in place. Is there more we can do? Yes, and we're doing it.
Mr. Speaker, the problem seems to be that home was understaffed, and we shouldn't be blaming often underpaid and hard-pressed care workers. We should be ensuring there are enough of them properly paid in all of those homes. There was a serious problem of understaffing, and it was the last Labour government that established the CQC, and I think a warning notice is insufficient. We need stronger action than that. Absolutely. Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, the government proposed that patients may have to show passports or other ID to access non-emergency health care. Has the government considered that the impact of this on elderly people? The last census showed us that 9.5 million people in this country don't have passports. Rather than distracting people with divisive and impractical policies, could the Prime Minister provide the NHS and social care with the money that it needs to care for the people who need the support?
Over the course of this Parliament, the government will be spending £500 billion on the National Health Service. The Right Honourable Gentleman asks about a process to ensure that people who are receiving NHS treatment are entitled to receive that NHS treatment. For many years, there has been a concern about health tourism, about people turning up in the UK, accessing health services and not paying for them. We want to make sure that those who are entitled to use the services are indeed able to see those free at the point of delivery, but that we deal with health tourism and those who should be paying for the use of our health service.
Mr. Speaker, Sir Simon Stevens said that, told us 2 weeks ago that the next 3 years are going to be the toughest ever for NHS funding, and that 2018 would see health spending per person cut for the first time ever in this country. And the NAO reported that the cost of health tourism is over 100 times less than the 22 billion of cuts the NHS is facing from this government. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, under this government, there are 6,000 fewer mental health nurses. There are a record 3.9 million people on NHS waiting lists. All of us who visit A&E departments know the stress the staff are under and that the waiting time is getting longer and longer. And that there are 1 million people in this country not receiving the social care that they need. So instead of looking for excuses and scapegoats, shouldn't the Prime Minister be ensuring that health and social care is properly resourced and properly funded to take away the stress and fear that people face in old age over social care and the stress that is placed on our very hard-working NHS and social care staff?
Billions of pounds extra into social care through the Social Care Precept and the Better Care Fund. £500 billion being spent on the National Health Service. A record level of investment in mental health in the National Health Service. But there's a fundamental...
Order. Members must not shout down or attempt to shout down the Prime Minister. The question has been asked, and it was heard, and the answer must be heard. The Prime Minister.
But there's a fundamental point that the Right Honourable Gentleman refrains from mentioning. It is this. We can only afford to pay for the National Health Service and for social care if we have a strong economy creating wealth. And that's precisely what he's going to hear from the Chancellor of the Exchequer in a few minutes' time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the 23rd of June, my constituents voted by a margin of 62% to 38% to leave the European Union. Many of those people are unhappy and frustrated, and what they see are delaying tactics by some Remainers who don't seem to understand the meaning of the word democracy.
Order, this is very discourteous. It's very discourteous. The honourable gentleman has a legitimate question, and that question, and every other question, should be fully and with politeness heard. The honourable gentleman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I will repeat it. Remainers who don't seem to understand the meaning of the word democracy, which I would remind them is government by the people, especially rule of the majority. With that in mind, what reassurance can my right honourable friend give my constituents and me that Article 50 will be triggered by March next year?
Well, I'm clear that we will trigger Article 50 by the end of March next year, but my honourable friend is absolutely right to make the key point. A referendum was decided, it was decided by this Parliament, 6-1, that the people should have the opportunity to vote on membership of the European Union. The vote was held, the turnout was high, the public gave their verdict. There must be no second referendum, no attempt to weasel out of this. This is the government that will deliver on the vote of the British people.
Angus Robertson.
Mr. Speaker, we on these benches have repeatedly brought up the devastating impact on disabled people from the UK benefits system. The government plans to cut support for people with long-term health difficulties by £30 a week. Last week, my SNP colleague, the member for Airdrie and Shotts, proposed a motion which was passed by this House with support from both Labour and Conservative members for these cuts to be postponed. Will the Prime Minister act on the vote of this House?
Let me say to the right honourable gentleman what we've been doing in relation to benefits for disabled people. The overall funding for disability benefits will be higher in every year up to 2020 than it was in 2010. We have been focusing support on those who most need it, those who are not able to get into the workplace. For those who are able at some stage to get into the workplace, we've been providing a wider package of support, and I'm pleased to say that over the last 3 years, nearly 600,000 more disabled people are now in the workplace with the dignity of having a job, which is what many people with disabilities want to have. So we're focusing help on those who most need it and helping those with disabilities who want to get into the workplace to do just that.
Sir Angus Robertson.
Mr. Speaker, it's widely trailed that the Prime Minister will make changes impacting on benefit recipients in work. Will the Prime Minister confirm that she has no intention of helping people with disabilities and medical conditions? Why should people who are unable to earn a living be punished for their disability or illness by losing £30 a week? Does she have any intention of changing that?
I have just set out for the right honourable gentleman the ways in which we are providing support and help for those people who have disabilities. As I said, the overall funding for spending on disability benefits will be higher in every year to 2020 than it was in 2010. But it is also important to recognise that when we give support for people with disabilities, it isn't simply about the benefit system and how much money they're given. For those in the workers, those who are able to get into work, and on that part of the ESA, we provide packages which are outside of the benefits as well, because we recognise that people want the dignity of getting into the workplace. That's what we are helping people with disabilities who can work to do.
Sir Simon Burns.
Will my right honourable friend agree that thousands of road commuters, including many of my constituents who use the A12, are travelling on roads that need to be repaired and upgraded? To improve connectivity and to speed up daily commute times, would my right honourable friend accept that the proposed £1.3 billion investment in improving our road network is warmly welcomed and will do a great deal to enhance connectivity in the country?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. The importance of infrastructure expenditure in helping to deal with the issue of productivity in our economy. And I'm pleased that that £1.3 billion for new roads does show us investing in the long-term future for Britain. It will lead. It's about delivering jobs. It's about delivering economic growth. It's about making sure that this is an economy that works for everyone. It's just one part of the package that we're proposing. But of course, my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, will be setting our proposals out more clearly in a few minutes' time.
Philip Sadiq.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent, Nazanin Ratcliffe, is in prison in Iran. Nazanin, a British national, has been separated from her husband and her 2-year-old daughter for 8 months now. She has been on hunger strike and is now suicidal. The Prime Minister needs to reunite this mother, this daughter, this wife with her family. Mr. Speaker, will it take Nazanin's death for the government to start taking her seriously?
Obviously, this is a very difficult time for the whole family, and I'm sure we're all concerned about the reports of the impact that detention is having on Nazanin Ratcliffe's health as she is in detention in Iran. This is an issue that has been repeatedly raised with the Iranian government by the UK government, both the previous Foreign Secretary and the current Foreign Secretary. I personally raised it with President Rouhani on the 20th of September in New York, where I stressed the importance of finding a resolution as soon as possible. I have since written to President Rouhani requesting confirmation of the charges, the sentence and the appeals process, and assurances that Mrs Zaghari Ratcliffe will be allowed full legal representation and regular contact with her family. But we will continue to do everything we can for the family, and that includes the British government remaining ready to help them bring Mrs Zaghari Ratcliffe's daughter back to Britain, if that is the request.
Mr. Peter Lilly.
Does my right honourable friend agree that most of our social problems are either caused or aggravated by the acute shortage of housing? So even if, as I hope, we manage to reduce the net immigration to this country, we will have to build far more new homes. So isn't the recommendation by the European Banking Authority to increase by 50% the reserves banks must hold against house building, making it even more costly for them to lend for housing than for unsecured credit cards, profoundly unhelpful and perverse?
Well, I'm sure my right honourable friend will recognise that we, of course, are subject to our own prudential regulation authorities, but the overall point he makes about the importance of house building is absolutely correct. We do need to build more homes. That's something the government has been doing. We've seen something like 900,000 new homes being built since 2010, but there is more for us to do, and that is what this government is working on.
Angela Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Brexit Secretary and the Foreign Secretary are described by a senior German politician as having no idea what Brexit really means. The Times reports today that EU ambassadors think the Foreign Secretary's more colourful outbursts are damaging our relationship with Member States. When is the Prime Minister going to get a grip on her ministers? And when is she going to demonstrate to the country and to our EU colleagues that she has a coherent, workable plan for Brexit?
I've been very clear in this House on many occasions about the plan that we have for Brexit. Crucially, we will be leaving the European Union, and we will be triggering Article 50 by the end of March next year, and that's when the formal negotiations will start. But it is absolutely right that we do not set out at this stage every single detail of our proposed negotiating strategy, because that would be the best way to get the worst possible deal for Britain.
This is Gerald Gillan.
As we leave the European Union, maintaining the UK's cutting edge and world leadership in scientific and technological discovery is of paramount importance to our industries and universities. Can I welcome the Prime Minister's announcement that each year we will invest a further $2 billion in research and development to boost our science and engineering base? Isn't this, Mr. Speaker, just the type of vital support that our businesses and researchers need, rather than the threats from the Labour Party to slash the R&D tax credits, which would hamper innovation and harm our economy?
Yes. My right honourable friend is absolutely right. The extra investment that we will be putting in into research and development is a crucial part of the long-term task we have of ensuring that we have the economy and the growth and prosperity in this country that we need. The new funds will be able to put us at the cutting edge of scientific discovery, which I saw for myself. We are already doing this. I was at the Wellcome Genome Campus in Cambridge on Monday, able to see the really exciting, really transformational work that is being done coming out of the knowledge base and scientific research here in the United Kingdom. We want to see more of that, and that's why we'll be investing in it.
John Woodcock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Aleppo's hospitals are destroyed, and Syrians who avoid the barrel bombs and the chlorine gas are starving from the Russian-backed blockade. We must do more. So will she revisit the prospect for aid drops? And will she look at backing the campaign to stop this daily perpetrator of war crimes, of stripping them of its right to hold the 2018 World Cup?
Well, the honourable gentleman is right to raise the issue of the appalling atrocities that are taking place in Aleppo. And it is right that we, along with our international allies, should be doing all that we can to try to bring this to a stop. He will recognise that the issue of who hosts sporting events is not in the government's remit. What is in the government's remit, and what we are doing, as I say, is working with our international allies to put more pressure on Russia to stop the appalling atrocities, the appalling attacks that are taking place in Aleppo. What we want to see is an agreement for a political transition to a Syria without President Assad.
On Whittingdale.
Does my right honourable friend agree that if the UK is to remain competitive and our citizens are to enjoy the benefits of a digital revolution, it is essential that we should be at the forefront of deployment of both ultra-fast broadband and 5G mobile connectivity? Can I therefore welcome the announcement, which we are led to believe may be made shortly, of a £1 billion investment to achieve this?
Well, my right honourable friend will, of course, be waiting in anticipation for my right honourable friend, the Chancellor's autumn statement. But he is absolutely right that as we look at improving productivity in this country, as we look to the economy of the future, the provision of that super-fast broadband, the provision of those new technological opportunities for people is absolutely a crucial part of that, and that is something that this government recognises and will act on.
Holly Lynch.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One day last week, 4 police officers in my constituency were assaulted over a single 24-hour period. There were over 23,000 assaults on police officers last year, and an assault on a police officer is an assault on society. What will the Prime Minister do to ensure that the toughest deterrents are in place to protect frontline officers? And when will she reduce the need for unsafe single crewing by restoring the numbers of police on our streets?
Well, can I send our best wishes to those police officers who were assaulted in her constituency last week? It is important that we recognise that when police officers go out on duty, and indeed for many off duty, they sometimes find themselves intervening in situations where they do find themselves on the receiving end of assaults and violence against them. They are willing to go forward in the line of duty where others are not, and we recognise that. What we have done in relation to this is we are looking, one of the things we want to do is to actually identify rather better the number of assaults that's taking place. That's why last year we issued some provisional figures. We're improving those figures now this year. Sentencing guidelines already allow for an assault on a police officer to be taken as an aggravating factor into account, but also new developments like the body-worn videos actually help to provide the evidence that ensure that people can be brought to justice and that actually deter assaults in the first place.
Andrew Mearison.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know the Prime Minister shares my concern at the level of acute hospital bed blocking. Does she agree with me that part of the solution is to promote community hospital beds where they still exist in places like Warminster and Shaftesbury as part of the sustainability and transformation planning process?
Well, as regards the STP process, of course, that will take place at local level. It will be at local level that these proposals will be considered and put forward by local clinicians. But the concept of being able to deal with the bed blocking in a variety of ways is absolutely right. There are good examples around the country where having those step-down beds available is actually resolving the problem of bed blocking. There are other ways in which it's being done, other parts of the country where social workers are being employed by hospital trusts, for example, but it's very good to recognise the good practice when it is being done, and we should see more of that across the country.
Tom Elliott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this month, IRA man turned lawyer Kieran Conway confessed to the BBC that he took part in robberies, bombings and gun attacks that murdered British soldiers. He stated he will never disclose information on any fellow IRA man, despite knowing details of IRA actions that he himself defines as constituting war crimes. Can the Prime Minister assure me that Her Majesty's Government will apply for the extradition of this terrorist for questioning from the Republic of Ireland?
The question as to whether or not an individual would be extradited or a request would be put in for extradited would be for the appropriate prosecution, investigation and prosecution authorities to take. What I do say to the honourable gentleman is that we do, of course, recognise the concerns for those cases where it is still possible to bring people for justice, and obviously want to see that being done.
John Stevenson.
Mr. Speaker, during the last 6 years, we've had 3 major referendums, all with varying degrees of excitement. Would the Prime Minister agree with me that you can have too much excitement, and will she therefore rule out any further referendums in this Parliament?
Well, my honourable friend is trying to tempt me down a route. One thing I will certainly rule out is a second referendum on whether or not we leave the European Union.
Mr. Speaker, Aberdeen Cyrenians have launched a financial appeal because of the increasing numbers of people finding themselves homeless as a direct result of the UK government's pursuit of austerity. Mr. Speaker, how can the Prime Minister sleep in her warm bed at night knowing her government's policies have consigned people to a cold Christmas?
The government is taking action in a variety of ways to address the issue of homelessness. Of course, one of the key things we need to do is ensure that we do see more homes being built in this country. But I just say this to the honourable lady. She talks about austerity in the sort of tone that she refers to it. Actually, austerity is about us living within our means. And we should always remember when we're talking about government providing support for individuals that taxpayers have to pay for that support, and many taxpayers are themselves struggling to get by.
Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will be aware that yesterday the Peninsula Rail Task Force launched its report, which was commissioned following the storms which severed Devon and Cornwall's vital rail link, just as our vital rail link was severed again, this time by flooding. Does she welcome the report, and will she commit the government to ensuring the vision it outlines is delivered?
I thank my honourable friend for his question. Can I suggest that he exercises a little more patience and listens very carefully to what my right honourable friend the Chancellor has to say?
Mr. Speaker, in these uncertain times, we would all surely agree that Britain needs strong defence. So how can the Prime Minister justify her government's decision to scrap all the Navy's heavyweight surface-to-surface guided missiles without any replacement?
Well, I have to say I don't recognise the picture that the honourable gentleman presents of what the government is doing in relation to the armed forces. We are investing billions of pounds in ensuring that our armed forces do have the missiles, the boats, the ships for the Royal Navy and the other pieces of equipment for the other armed forces. So the picture he presents is not the picture I recognise.
Julian Brazier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend agree that it would be good for confidence in the rule of law if judges did not enter into speculative public thoughts on cases that they're about to hear?
We value in this country the independence of our judiciary. That's the independence for the judiciary when they come to make their judgments in court, but also they are independent, and it is to them to determine what they choose to put in their speeches or not for the government to tell them what to do.
Tim Farron.
Mr. Speaker, as millions of public sector workers face another year of suppressed pay, after another week of shambolic Brexit negotiations, and with the National Health Service facing a winter crisis and crying out for cash, does the Prime Minister worry that her government is only just about managing?
say to the right honourable gentleman that we're very clear about the amounts of money that we're putting into the National Health Service. He talks about the negotiations. Actually, the negotiations for us leaving the European Union don't formally start until we trigger Article 50. We will be triggering Article 50 by the end of March next year. What the right honourable gentleman wants to do is to stop us from leaving the European Union by denying the people the decision and the deliverability of the vote that they took rightly on the 23rd of June. He wants to deny people what they want. We're going to give it to them.
Charlie Elphick. Mr. Speaker, may I raise with the Prime Minister the concerns of millions of drivers and hauliers across the United Kingdom who worry about the cost of driving, cost of fuel duty, whether her government will look at keeping that down, and also at the pump pricing and how forecourt pricing is worked as the oil price changes. Prices jump like a rocket and fall like a feather.
Well, I recognise, as my honourable friend says, that many people look with very great concern about the cost of motoring in this country. I suggest, as I have done to some of my other honourable friends, that he is a little more patient and waits for the Chancellor's autumn statement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has talked about her worries with social care, but surely we have to judge her by her actions. In the last 6 years, there's been a 37% on average cut in local authority funding, 57% in my area, and nearly a quarter of all of those older people in need of social care have been denied any help at all. What is she going to do about it?
The right honourable lady might have noticed that I have been asked several questions about social care, and I will give the answer. I will give the answer that I have given previously. What this government is doing about social care is putting more money in through the Better Care Fund, giving local authorities the opportunity through the social care precept, and making sure that health and social care come together to ensure that we deal with the issue of bed blocking.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, how many of us would charge into a darkened store at night knowing that inside were 3 mask-wearing, crowbar-wielding thugs trying to rob a store? Well, my 2 constituents, Nigel Dunmore and Grant McGarry, did just that. And by intervening, the thugs fled, leaving the money, the staff were hurt less, and one of the gentlemen was hurt himself. Will my right honourable friend join me in praising their courage and selflessness in this extraordinary act of bravado?
I absolutely... I absolutely agree with my honourable friend, and I commend the bravery and courage that was shown by those 2 individuals. I think he said Nigel and Gart, who stepped into that situation to ensure that it was not as bad as it might have been. That is incredible bravery. There are many members of the public who would not have been willing to step forward in that way, and can he pass my best wishes, and I'm sure the best wishes of the whole House, onto those individuals.
Finally, Gloria De Piero.
Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister believe that big companies should put a worker on the board?
I believe that we should see workers' representation on boards, and I make no apology for the fact that this government is going to deliver on that. For all their years in government, the Labour Party did nothing.
Statement, the First Secretary of State and Chancellor of the Exchequer, Chancellor Philip Hammond.
Mr. Speaker, it's a privilege to report today on an economy which the IMF predicts will be the fastest growing major advanced economy in the world this year. An economy with employment at a record high and unemployment at an 11-year low. An economy which, through the hard work of the British people, has bounced back from the depths of Labour's recession. And an economy which has confounded commentators at home and abroad with its strength and its resilience since the British people decided exactly 5 months ago today to leave the European Union and chart a new future for our country. Mr. Speaker, that decision will change the course of Britain's history. It has thrown into sharp relief the fundamental strengths of the British economy that will ensure our future success. The global reach of our services industries, the strength of our science and high-tech manufacturing base, and the cutting-edge British businesses that are leading the world in disruptive technologies. But it's a decision that also makes more urgent than ever the need to tackle our economy's long-term weaknesses, like the productivity gap, the housing challenge, and the damaging imbalance in economic growth and prosperity across our country. Mr. Speaker, we resolve today to confront those challenges head-on, to prepare our country to seize the opportunities ahead, and in doing so, to build an economy that works for everyone, and an economy where every corner of this United Kingdom is part of our national success. Mr. Speaker, I want to pay tribute to my predecessor, my right honourable friend, the member for Tatton. My style, Mr. Speaker, will of course be different from his. I suspect that I will prove no more adept at pulling rabbits from hats than my successor as Foreign Secretary has been at retrieving balls from the back of scrums. But my focus on building Britain's long-term future will be the same. He took over an economy on the brink of collapse, with the highest budget deficit in our post-war history, and brought it down by 2/3. That is a record of which he can be proud. But times have moved on, and our task now is to prepare our economy to be resilient as we exit the EU and match fit for the transition that will follow. So we will maintain our commitment to fiscal discipline while recognising the need for investment to drive productivity and fiscal headroom to support the economy through the transition. Mr. Speaker, let me turn now to the forecasts. Since 2010, the Office for Budget Responsibility has provided an independent economic and fiscal forecast to which the government must respond. Gone are the days when the Chancellor could mark his own homework. And I thank Robert Choate and his team for their hard work. Today's OBR forecast is for growth to be 2.1% in 2016, higher than forecast in March. In 2017, the OBR forecasts growth to slow to 1.4%, which they attribute to lower investment and weaker consumer demand, driven respectively by greater uncertainty and by higher inflation resulting from sterling depreciation. That is slower, of course, than we would wish, but still equivalent to the IMF's forecast for Germany and higher than the forecast for growth in many of our European neighbours, including France and Italy, a fact that will, no doubt, be a source of very considerable irritation to some. As the effects of uncertainty diminish, the OBR forecasts growth recovering to 1.7% in 2018, 2.1% in 2019 and 2020, and 2% in 2021. While the OBR is clear that it cannot predict the deal the UK will strike with the EU, its current view is that the referendum decision means that potential growth over the forecast period is likely to be 2.4 percentage points lower than would otherwise have been the case. The OBR acknowledges that there is a higher degree of uncertainty around these figures than usual. Despite slower growth, the UK labour market is forecast to remain robust. We have delivered over 2.7 million new jobs since 2010, and this forecast, Mr. Speaker, shows that number growing in every year. Another 500,000 jobs created over the OBR forecast, providing security for working people across the length and breadth of Britain. Mr. Speaker, for those who claim that the recovery is just a southeast phenomenon, I have some news. Over the past year, employment grew fastest in the northeast, the claimant count fell fastest in Northern Ireland, pay grew most strongly in the West Midlands, and every UK nation and region saw a record number of people in work. That, Mr. Speaker, is a labour market recovery that is working for everyone. Monetary policy has played an important role in supporting growth since the referendum decision. But a credible fiscal policy remains essential for maintaining market confidence and restoring the economy to long-term health. In view of the uncertainty facing the economy and in the face of slower growth forecasts, we no longer seek to deliver a surplus in 2019-20. But the Prime Minister and I, Mr. Speaker, remain firmly committed to seeing the public finances return to balance as soon as practicable, while leaving enough flexibility to support the economy in the near term. Today, I am publishing a new draft charter for budget responsibility with 3 fiscal rules. First, the public finances should be returned to balance as early as possible in the next Parliament, and in the interim, Mr. Speaker, cyclically adjusted borrowing should be below 2% by the end of this Parliament. Second, that public sector net debt as a share of GDP must be falling by the end of this Parliament. And third, that welfare spending must be within a cap set by the government and monitored by the OBR. In the absence of an effective framework, the welfare bill in our country spiralled out of control, with spending on working age benefits trebling in real terms between 1980 and 2010. As a result of the action that we've taken since 2010, that spending has now stabilised, and the cap I'm announcing today takes into account the policy changes made since the last budget, setting a realistic baseline reflecting all announced welfare policies, and I confirm again today that the government has no plans to introduce further welfare savings measures in this Parliament beyond those already announced. I now turn, Mr. Speaker, to the OBR's fiscal forecasts, but first I will set out the key drivers of changes since the budget. The post-budget changes that were made to welfare and housing policies cost the Exchequer £8.6 billion over the forecast period. Expected ONS classification changes have added £12 billion since budget. And tax receipts have been lower than expected this year, causing the OBR to revise down projected revenues in future. Added to this is a structural effect of rapidly rising incorporation and self-employment, which further erodes revenues. Combining these pressures with the impact of forecast weaker growth and taking account of the measures I shall announce today, the OBR now forecasts that in cash terms, borrowing is set to be £68.2 billion this year, falling to £59 billion next year, £46.5 billion in 18-19, then £21.9 billion, £20.7 billion, and finally £17.2 billion in 21-22. Overall, public sector net borrowing as a percentage of GDP will fall from 4% last year to 3.5% this year, and will continue to fall over the Parliament, reaching 0.7% in 21-22. This will be, Mr. Speaker, the lowest deficit as a share of GDP in 2 decades. The OBR expects cyclically adjusted public sector net borrowing to be 0.8% of GDP in 2020-21, comfortably meeting our target to reduce it to less than 2%, and importantly, leaving significant flexibility to respond to any headwinds the economy may encounter. The OBR's forecast of higher borrowing and slower asset sales, together with the temporary effect of the Bank of England's action to stimulate growth, translates into an increased forecast for debt in the near term. The OBR forecasts that debt will rise from 84.2% of GDP last year to 87.3% this year, peaking at 90.2% in 2017-18 as the Bank of England's monetary policy interventions approach their full effect. In 2018-19, debt is projected to fall to 89.7% of national income, the first fall in the national debt as a share of GDP since 2001-2, and it is forecast to continue falling thereafter. Members of the House may be interested to know that stripping out the effects of the Bank of England interventions, underlying debt peaks this year at 82.4% of GDP and falls thereafter to 77.7% by 21-22. Mr. Speaker, it is customary in the run-up to the autumn statement to hear representations from the Shadow Chancellor of the day, usually for untenable levels of spending and borrowing. We used to think on this side of the House that Ed Ball's demands were an extreme example, but I have to say the current Shadow Chancellor has outperformed him in the fiscal incontinence sweepstake, Mr. Speaker. What we don't know, of course, is whether he can also dance. I have received some... He can. Good. Good. A second career awaits him, Mr. Speaker. I have received, Mr. Speaker, some more measured representations from a range of external bodies, some of them calling for fiscal expansion, while others have suggested that there is no need at all to respond to a changed economic outlook. And that reflects, to be fair, the challenge that we face of resolving how best to protect the recovery, build on the economy's manifest strengths, yet at the same time respond appropriately to the warnings of a more difficult period ahead. But with our debt forecast to peak at over 90% next year and a deficit this year of 3.5%, I have reached my own judgment. It is a judgment based on a sober analysis of our fiscal position, but also a realistic appraisal of the weakness of UK productivity and the urgent need to address our fiscal challenge from both ends, continuing to control public expenditure, but also growing the potential of the economy and protecting the tax base. So we choose in this autumn statement to prioritise additional high-value investment, specifically in infrastructure and innovation, that will directly contribute to raising Britain's productivity. And the key judgment we make today, Mr. Speaker, is that our hard-won credibility on public spending means that we can fund this commitment in the short term from additional borrowing, while funding all other new policies announced in this autumn statement through additional tax and spending measures. That is the responsible way to secure our economy for the long term. Mr. Speaker, the productivity gap is well known to honourable and right honourable members, but shocking nonetheless. It bears repeating. We lag the US and Germany by some 30 percentage points in productivity, but we also lag France by over 20 points and Italy by 8 points, which means in the real world it takes a German worker 4 days to produce what we make in 5. And that means, in turn, that too many British workers work longer hours for lower pay than their counterparts. And that has to change if we are to build an economy that works for everyone. So raising productivity, Mr. Speaker, is essential for the high-wage, high-skill economy that will deliver higher living standards for working people across this country. As a result of decisions taken by my predecessor, public investment is higher over this decade than it was over the whole of the period of the last Labour government. But today I can go further. I can announce that we are forming a new National Productivity Investment Fund of £23 billion to be spent on innovation and infrastructure over the next 5 years, investing today for the economy of the future. Let me set out, Mr. Speaker, for the House how this money will be used. Mr. Speaker, we do not invest enough in research, development and innovation. As the pace of technology advances and competition from the rest of the world increases, we must build on our strengths in science and tech innovation to ensure that the next generation of discoveries is not only made here, but is also developed and produced in Britain. So today I can confirm the additional investment in R&D rising to an extra £2 billion per year by 2021, announced by my right honourable friend the Prime Minister on Monday. Mr. Speaker, economically productive infrastructure directly benefits businesses, but families too rely on roads, rail, telecoms, and especially housing. We've made good progress, with the number of new homes being built last year hitting an 8-year high. But for too many, the goal of home ownership remains out of reach. In October, my right honourable friend, the Communities Secretary, launched the £3 billion Home Builders Fund to unlock over 200,000 homes and up to £2 billion to accelerate construction on public sector land. But we must go further still. The challenge of delivering the housing we so desperately need in the places where it is currently least affordable is not, of course, a new one, but the effect of unaffordable housing on our nation's productivity makes it an urgent one. My right honourable friend, the Communities Secretary, will bring forward a housing white paper in due course, addressing these long-term challenges. But in the meantime, we can take further steps. One of the biggest objections to housing development, as honourable and right honourable members will know from their own constituencies, is often the impact on local infrastructure. So we will focus government infrastructure investment to unlock land for housing, with a new £2.3 billion housing infrastructure fund to deliver infrastructure for up to 100,000 new homes in areas of high demand. And to provide affordable housing that supports a wide range of need, we will invest a further £1.4 billion to deliver 40,000 additional affordable homes. And I will also relax restrictions on government grant to allow providers to deliver a wider range of housing types. I can also announce a large-scale regional pilot of right to buy for housing association tenants, and continued support for home ownership through the Help to Buy Equity Loan Scheme and the Help to Buy ISA. Mr. Speaker, this package means that over the course of this Parliament, the Government expects to more than double, in real terms, annual capital spending on housing. Coupled with our resolve to tackle the long-term challenges of land supply, this commitment to housing delivery represents a step change in our ambition to increase the supply of homes for sale and for rent, to deliver a housing market that works for everyone. Mr. Speaker, reliable transport networks are essential to growth and productivity. So this autumn statement commits significant additional funding to help keep Britain moving now and to invest in the transport networks and vehicles of the future. I will commit an additional £1.1 billion of investment in English local transport networks, where small investments can often offer big wins. £220 million additionally to address traffic pinch points on strategic roads, £450 million to trial digital signalling on our railways to achieve a step change in reliability and to squeeze more capacity out of our existing rail infrastructure, something I know the Leader of the Opposition will welcome. And finally, Mr. Speaker, £390 million to build on our competitive advantage in low-emission vehicles and the development of connected autonomous vehicles, plus 100% first-year capital allowance for the installation of electric vehicle charging infrastructure. The Department for Transport will continue to work with Transport for the North to develop detailed options for the Northern Powerhouse Rail, and my right honourable friend, the Transport Secretary, will set out more details of specific projects and priorities over the coming weeks. Mr. Speaker, our future transport, business and lifestyle needs will require world-class digital infrastructure to underpin them. So my ambition is for... Yeah, it says here because I wrote it here. So my ambition, Mr. Speaker, is for the UK to be a world leader in 5G. That means a full fibre network, a step change in speed, security and reliability. So we will invest over £1 billion in our digital infrastructure to catalyse private investment in fibre networks and to support 5G trials. And from April, we will introduce 100% business rates relief for a 5-year period on new fibre infrastructure, supporting further rollout of fibre to homes and businesses. We have chosen, Mr. Speaker, to borrow to kickstart a transformation in infrastructure and innovation investment. But we must sustain this effort over the long term if we're to make a lasting difference to the UK's productivity performance. So today I have written to the National Infrastructure Commission to ask them to make their recommendations on the future infrastructure needs of the country using the assumption that the government will invest between 1% and 1.2% of GDP every year from 2020 in economic infrastructure covered by the Commission. To put that in context, we'll spend around 0.8% of GDP on the same definition this year. I am also backing the Commission's interim recommendations on the Oxford-Cambridge Growth Corridor published last week, with £110 million of funding for East West Rail and a commitment to deliver the new Oxford to Cambridge Expressway. But, Mr. Speaker, this project can be more than just a transport link. It can become a transformational tech corridor drawing on the world-class research strengths of our two best-known universities. So I welcome the Commission's continuing work on delivery model options, and we will carefully consider its final recommendations in due course. The major increase in infrastructure spending I've announced today will represent a significant increase in funding through the Barnett formula of over £250 million to the Northern Ireland Executive, £400 million to the Welsh Government and £800 million to the Scottish Government. But, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure he will in a moment. But, Mr. Speaker, public investment is only part of the picture. About half of our economic infrastructure is financed by the private sector, and we will continue to support that investment through the UK Guarantee Scheme, which I am today extending until at least 2026. The new capital investment I've announced will provide the financial backbone for the government's industrial strategy, which the Prime Minister spoke about on Monday, a firm foundation upon which my right honourable friend, the Business Secretary, will work with industry to build our ambition of an economy that works for all. And I can announce 4 further measures to back business. I'm doubling UK export finance capacity to make it easier for British businesses to export. I'm funding Charlie Mayfield's business-led initiative to boost management skills across British businesses. And I'm taking a first step to tackle the long-standing problem of our fastest-growing start-up tech firms being snapped up by bigger companies rather than growing to scale by injecting an initial £400 million into venture capital funds through the British Business Bank, unlocking £1 billion of new finance for growing firms. And I'm also launching today a Treasury-led review of the barriers to accessing patient capital in the UK so that we can take further action to address them. Mr. Speaker, this government recognises that for too long economic growth in our country has been too concentrated in London and the South East. That is not just a social problem, it's an economic problem. London is one of the highest productivity cities in the world, and we should celebrate that fact. But no other major developed economy has such a gap between the productivity of its capital city and its second and third cities. So we must drive up the performance of our regional cities. Today we publish our strategy for addressing productivity barriers in the Northern Powerhouse and give the go-ahead to a programme of major road schemes in the north. Our Midlands Engine strategy will follow shortly, but I am today providing funding so that the evaluation study for the Midlands Rail Hub can go ahead. In addition, we are investing in local infrastructure in every region of England. I can announce the allocation of £1.8 billion from the Local Growth Fund to the English regions, £556 million to local enterprise partnerships in the north of England, £542 million to the Midlands and East of England, and £683 million to LEPs in the South West, South East and London. We will announce the detailed breakdown of allocations to individual LEPs shortly. Devolution, Mr. Speaker, remains at the heart of this government's approach to supporting local growth, and we recommit today to our city deals with Swansea, Edinburgh, North Wales and Tay cities. And I can announce today that we are beginning negotiations on a city deal for Stirling, so that every single city in Scotland will be on course to have a city deal. To support new mayoral combined authorities in England, I can announce that we will grant them new borrowing powers to reflect their new responsibilities. And while we continue discussions with London and the West Midlands on possible devolution of further powers, I can announce today that London will receive £3.15 billion as its share of national affordable housing funding to deliver a commitment of over 90,000 affordable homes, and also that we are devolving to London the adult education budget and giving London greater control over the delivery of employment support services for the hardest to help. Mr. Speaker, I have deliberately avoided making this statement into a long list of individual projects being supported. But I am going to make one exception. I will act today with just 7 days to spare to save one of the UK's most important historic houses, Wentworth Woodhouse near Rotherham. It is said to be the inspiration for Pemberley in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. But in 1946, in an extraordinary act of cultural vandalism, the then Labour government authorised extensive open-cast coal mining virtually up to the front door of this precious property. Perhaps, Mr. Speaker, that's Labour's idea of a northern powerhouse. Wentworth Woodhouse is now at critical risk of being lost to future
house. It sounds very interesting indeed. Chancellor.
Wentworth Woodhouse, Mr. Speaker, is now at critical risk of being lost to future generations. A local effort has been hugely successful in securing millions of pounds in funding from various foundations and charities, subject to the balance required to make the house safe being found by November 30th. So we will today provide a £7.6 million grant towards urgent repairs to safeguard this key piece of northern heritage, all but destroyed by a Labour government, saved by a Conservative one. I can also, Mr. Speaker, confirm distribution of a further £102 million of LIBOR bank fines to armed forces and emergency services charities, including, my honourable friends will be pleased to hear, £20 million to support the Defence and National Rehabilitation Centre at Stamford Hall in Nottinghamshire, as well as £3 million from the Tampon Tax Fund for comic relief to distribute to a range of women's charities. Mr. Speaker, we choose to invest in our economic infrastructure because it can transform the growth potential of our economy, as well as improving the quality of people's lives. But that investment is only possible because we on this side of the House are prepared to take the tough decisions to maintain control of current spending, every one of them opposed by the party opposite. When we took office in 2010, public spending was 45% of GDP. This year, it is set to be 40%. And during those 6 years, we've seen crime fall by more than a quarter, the highest proportion ever of good or outstanding schools. The number of doctors has increased by 10,000 in our NHS, pensioner poverty at its lowest level ever, the lowest ever number of children being raised in workless households, and the highest ever number of young people going on to study full-time at university. We have demonstrated beyond doubt that controlling public spending is compatible with world-class public services and social improvement. But as the OBR's debt projections demonstrate, we have more work to do to eliminate the deficit. So departmental spending plans set out in the spending review last autumn will remain in place, and departmental expenditure in 21-22 will grow in line with inflation. The £3.5 billion of savings to be delivered through the efficiency review announced at the budget and led by my right honourable friend the Chief Secretary must be delivered in full. I have, however, exceptionally agreed to provide additional funding to the Ministry of Justice to tackle urgent prison safety issues, increasing the number of prison officers by 2,500. Mr. Speaker, having run two large spending departments in previous roles, I came to this job with some very clear views about the relationship between the Treasury and spending departments. I want departments to be incentivised to drive efficiencies, and I want the Treasury to be an enabler for good, effective spending across government. To kickstart this new approach, I will allow up to £1 billion of the savings found by the efficiency review to be reinvested in 1920 in priority areas, and I have budgeted today accordingly. Mr. Speaker, we manage public spending so that we can invest in the public's priorities, and this government has underlined those priorities with a series of commitments and protections for the duration of this Parliament. And I can confirm today that despite the fiscal pressure, we will meet our commitments to protect the budgets of key public services and defence. We will keep our promise to the world's poorest through our overseas aid budget, and we will meet our pledge to our country's pensioners through the triple lock. But as we look ahead to the next Parliament, we will need to ensure that we tackle the challenges of rising longevity and fiscal sustainability. And so the government will review public spending priorities and other commitments for the next Parliament in light of the evolving fiscal position at the next spending review. Mr. Speaker, I now turn to taxation. Since 2010, this government has put a business-led recovery at the heart of our plan. We've cut corporation tax from 28% to 20%, sending the message that Britain is open for business. The additional investment in productivity and infrastructure that I've announced today underscores that message, and the raft of investments in the UK announced since the referendum by SoftBank, Glaxo, Nissan, Google and Apple, amongst others, confirms it. My priority as Chancellor is to ensure that Britain remains the #1 destination for business, creating the investment, the jobs and the prosperity to protect our long-term future. I know how much business values certainty and stability, and so I confirm today that we will stick to the business tax roadmap that we set out in March. Corporation tax will fall to 17%, by far the lowest overall rate of corporate tax in the G20. We will deliver the commitments we have made to the oil and gas sector. The carbon price support will continue to be capped out to 2020, and we will implement the business rates reduction package worth £6.7 billion. I can also confirm today that, having consulted further, my right honourable friend the Communities Secretary will lower the transitional relief cap from 45% next year to 43% and from 50% to 32% the year after. That's complicated, but it's good news. Just in case anybody wasn't sure, Mr. Speaker. And I will also increase the rural rate relief to 100%, giving small businesses in rural areas a tax break worth up to £2,900 per year. But, Mr. Speaker, in return for these highly competitive tax rates, the tax base must be sustainable. From April 2017, we will align the employee and employer national insurance thresholds at £157 per week. There will be no cost to employees, and the maximum cost to business will be an annual £7.18 per employee. Insurance premium tax in this country is lower than in many other European countries and half the rate of VAT. In order to raise revenue, which is required to fund the spending commitments I am making today, it will rise from 10% currently to 12% from next June. At the same time, I can confirm that the government's commitment to legislate next year to end the compensation culture surrounding whiplash claims, a major area of insurance fraud, and that will save drivers an average of £40 on their annual premiums. Mr. Speaker, technological progress is changing the way people live and the way they work. The tax system needs to keep pace. For example, the OBR has highlighted today the growing cost to the Exchequer of incorporation. So the government will consider how we can ensure that the taxation of different ways of working is fair between different individuals doing essentially the same work and sustains the tax base as the economy undergoes rapid change. We will consult in due course on any proposed changes. In the meantime, the government will take action now to reduce the difference between the treatment of cash earnings and benefits. The majority of employees pay tax on a cash salary, but some are able to sacrifice salary by agreement with their employer and pay much lower tax on benefits in kind. This is unfair, and so from April 2017, employers and employees who use these schemes will pay the same taxes as everyone else. Following consultation with stakeholders, ultra-low emission cars, pension savings, childcare and the cycle to work scheme will be excluded from this change. And certain long-term arrangements will be protected until April 2021. For pensions that have been drawn down, I will also reduce to £4,000 the money purchase annual allowance to prevent inappropriate double tax relief being gained. This government, Mr. Speaker, has done more than any other to tackle tax evasion, avoidance and aggressive tax planning. And the UK tax gap, it may surprise some honourable members opposite to hear, is now one of the lowest in the world. But we must constantly be alert to new threats to our tax base and be willing to move swiftly to counter them. At the budget, we committed to removing the tax benefits of disguised earnings for employees, and I am now going to do the same for the self-employed and employers, raising a further £630 million over the forecast period. We will shut down inappropriate use of the VAT flat rate scheme that was put in place to help small businesses. We will abolish the tax advantages linked to employee shareholder status in response to growing evidence that it is being primarily used for tax planning purposes by high-earning individuals. And we will introduce a new penalty for those who enable the use of a tax avoidance scheme that HMRC later challenges and defeats. These measures and others set out in the autumn statement document raise around £2 billion over the forecast period. Mr. Speaker, there is understandable public concern that the pitch is tilted in favour of large multinational groups which are able to use cross-border structures to manage their tax liabilities. Following detailed consultation, I can confirm that we will implement our new restriction on tax relief for corporate interest expenses and reform the way that relief is provided for historic losses. These measures, scored at Budget 2016, will help to ensure large businesses will always pay tax in years where they make substantial profits. They will also mean that businesses cannot avoid tax by borrowing excessively in the UK to fund their overseas activities. They take effect in April and raise over £5 billion from the largest businesses in the UK. Mr. Speaker, I said that the tax system must be fair, and that means rewarding those who work hard by helping them to keep more of what they earn. And there is one tax reform this government has pursued since 2010 that has done more than any other to improve the lot of working people: raising the tax-free personal allowance. When we entered government in 2010, it was £6,475. Now, after 6 years, it is £11,000 and will rise to £11,500 in April. As a result, we have more than halved the tax bill of someone with a salary of £15,000 to just £800. That is a massive boost to the incomes of low and middle earners. Since 2010, we've cut income tax for 28 million people and taken 4 million people out of income tax altogether. And I can confirm today that despite the challenging fiscal forecasts, we will deliver on our commitment to raising the allowance to £12,500 and the higher rate threshold to £50,000 by the end of this Parliament. Once that £12,500 has been reached, Mr. Speaker, the personal allowance will rise automatically during the 2020s in line with inflation rather than the national minimum wage as currently planned. It will be for the Chancellor to decide from year to year whether more is affordable. As well as taking millions of ordinary people out of tax, we are the government that introduced the national living wage and gave a pay rise, Mr. Speaker, to over 1 million workers. They don't like it. A Tory government gave a pay rise to over 1 million of the lowest paid workers. We are the government that introduced 15 hours a week of free childcare for all 3- and 4-year-olds and will double that for working families from September. The government whose education reforms have raised standards and expanded opportunity with 1.4 million more children now in good or outstanding schools. And the new capital funding that I've provided today for grammar schools will help to continue that trend. And we, Mr. Speaker, are the government that pledged to invest in our NHS, and we are delivering on that promise, backing the NHS 5-year forward view plan for the future with £10 billion of additional funding by the end of 2020-2021. But we recognise that more needs to be done to help families make ends meet and to ensure every household has opportunities to prosper. So today I can announce that the national living wage will increase from £7.20 to £7.50 in April next year. That's a pay rise worth over £500 a year to a full-time worker. Mr. Speaker, creating jobs, lowering taxes and raising wages addresses directly the concerns of ordinary families. And the revenue-raising measures that I've announced today enable me to go further to help families on low wages. Universal credit is an important reform to our benefit system and is designed to make sure that work always pays. We want to reinforce that position. I have considered very carefully the arguments made by my right honourable friend, the member for Chinkford and Woodford Green, by my honourable friend, the member for Enfield Southgate and others, and weighed them carefully against the fiscal constraints we are facing. I have concluded that from April we can reduce the universal credit taper rate from 65% to 63%. This is effectively a targeted tax cut worth £700 million a year by 21-22 for those in work on low incomes. It will increase the incentive to work and encourage progression in work, and it will help 3 million households across our country. Mr. Speaker, we believe that a market economy is the best way of delivering sustained prosperity for the British people. We will always support a market-led approach, but we will not be afraid to intervene where there is evidence of market failure. We will look carefully over the coming months at the functioning of key markets, including the retail energy market, to make sure they are functioning fairly for all consumers. And in the private rental market, letting agents are currently able to charge unregulated fees to tenants. We've seen these fees spiral, despite attempts to regulate them, often to hundreds of pounds. This is wrong. Landlords appoint letting agents and landlords should meet their fees. So I can announce today that we will ban fees to tenants as soon as possible. And also, Mr. Speaker, we will consult on how best to ban pensions cold calling and a wider range of pension scams. We can also help today those who rely on income from modest savings to get by. Low interest rates have helped our economy recover, but they've significantly reduced the interest people can earn on their cash savings. So we will launch a new market-leading savings bond through NS&I. The detail will be announced at the budget, but we expect our new investment bond will have an interest rate of around 2.2% gross and a term of 3 years. Savers will be able to deposit up to £3,000, and we expect around 2 million people to benefit. Mr. Speaker, the announcements I have made today lower taxes on working people, boost wages, back savers and bear down on bills. In early 2017, we will begin the rollout of tax-free childcare across Britain, providing a saving of up to £2,000 per child. And once it's rolled out, we pledge to keep it under review to ensure that it is indeed delivering the support they need to working families. There is one further area of household expenditure where the government can help. The oil price has risen by over 60% since January, and sterling has declined by 15% against the dollar. That means, of course, significant pressure on prices at the pumps here in Britain. So today, we stand on the side of millions of hard-working people in our country by cancelling the fuel duty rise for the 7th successive year. In total, this saves the average car driver £130 a year and the average van driver £350 a year. This is a tax cut worth £850 million next year, Mr. Speaker, and means the current fuel duty freeze is the longest for 40 years. Mr. Speaker, I have one further announcement to make. This is my first autumn statement as Chancellor. After careful consideration and detailed discussion with the Prime Minister, I have decided that it will also be my last. Mr. Speaker, I am abolishing the autumn statement. No other major economy makes hundreds of tax changes twice a year, and neither should we. So the spring budget in a few months will be the final spring budget. Starting in autumn 2017, Britain will have an autumn budget announcing tax changes well in advance of the start of the tax year. From 2018, there will be a spring statement responding to the forecast. Perhaps they should have read their briefing, Mr. Speaker.
A great state of emotion. Some people are very easily humoured. I'm glad to see they're so humoured. But we must hear the Chancellor. Chancellor.
Perhaps they should have read their briefing, Mr. Speaker, because they might remember that Parliament has mandated the Office of Budget Responsibility to produce a report to Parliament twice a year and has mandated the government to reply to it. So from 2018, there will be a spring statement responding to the forecast from the OBR, but no major fiscal event. If unexpected changes in the economy require it, I will, of course, reserve the right to announce actions at the spring statement, but I will not make significant changes twice a year just for the sake of it. This change will allow for greater parliamentary scrutiny of budget measures ahead of their implementation. Mr. Speaker, this is a long overdue reform to our tax policy making process and brings the UK into line with best practice recommended by the IMF, the IFS, Institute for Government and many others. Mr. Speaker, the OBR report today confirms the underlying strength and resilience of the British economy. This autumn statement responds to the challenge of building on that strength while also heeding the warnings in the OBR's figures as we begin writing this new chapter in our country's history. It restates our commitment to living within our means, and it sets out our choice to invest in our future. It sends a clear message to the world that Britain is open for business, and it provides help to those who need it now. So, Mr. Speaker, we have made our choices. We have set our course. We are a great nation, bold in our vision, confident in our strengths, and determined in our ambition to build a country that works for everyone. I commend this statement.
John McDonnell.
This morning, Mr. Speaker, this morning we've heard the verdict from the trial following the tragic murder of Joe Cox. Joe Cox's murder robbed this House of a fierce advocate for social justice and a passionate campaigner. Her killing was an attack on democracy itself. Our thoughts are with her family this morning. Mr. Speaker, today's statement places on record the abject failure of the last 6 wasted years and offers no hope for the future. The figures speak for themselves. Growth down, wage growth down, business investment down, and the deficit and their own deficit target failed. The debt target failed. The welfare cap failed. We've heard today, Mr. Speaker.
Order. Let me just say now, if members on either side want to shout out, don't bother to stand because you won't be called. I say that to members on both sides. Stop it. It's juvenile, low grade, and hugely deprecated by the public, whose support we should be seeking and whom we should try to impress, not to repel. John McDonnell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've heard today there'll be more taxes, more debt, and more borrowing. The verdict could not be clearer. The so-called long-term economic plan has failed. And as the Treasury's own leaked paper revealed, the government knew it had failed before the referendum result was announced. And we now face Brexit, the greatest economic challenge of a generation, and we face it unprepared and ill-equipped. The new Chancellor acknowledged the failure himself in October of the economic strategy when he promised a reset of economic policy. So today we expected a change of direction after those 6 wasted years. Instead, we've seen further cuts to earnings for those in work through cuts to universal credit and a living wage increase that is lower than expected under the previous Chancellor. This is a new Conservative leadership with no answers to the challenges facing our country following Brexit and no vision to secure our future prosperity. Just turning to Brexit, Labour respects the decision of the British people to leave the European Union, but the chaotic Tory handling of Brexit threatens the future prosperity of this country. The Chancellor must now do the right thing for British workers and businesses. He must insist on full tariff-free access to the single market. He and the Treasury know that's what will give the best deal for jobs and prosperity here. I just say it may not be in the Chancellor's nature, but in the national interest, I urge him to stand up to the Prime Minister and the extreme Brexit fanatics in her cabinet. If he stands up for British businesses and jobs in fighting for single market access, he will have our full support. But after 6 wasted years, wages are still lower than 2008. Self-employed people are on average paid less than a generation ago. 6 million people are earning less than the living wage. Too many people are having to worry about buying school uniforms, affording a family holiday, or even just paying the rent or mortgage. We've had a month of briefing from the party opposite on those people who are called just about managing, the jams. To the party opposite, These people are just an electoral demographic. To us, they're our friends, our neighbours, and the people we represent. Let me tell you what they are, why they are just managing. Why are they just managing? It's the results of Tories imposing austerity on an economy that couldn't bear the strain. We've seen productivity stagnate, but there's nothing in this autumn statement on the scale needed to overturn those 6 wasted years. If the Chancellor really wants to make a fair tax system as well, he can start by bringing back the 50p rate for the very richest in our country. And it is familiar, hollow rhetoric from the Tories on tax avoidance when they've cut the resources at HMRC, the very people there staffed to collect the taxes themselves. Resources available to HMRC today are 40% less than they were in 2000. The Chancellor has frozen in-work benefits at a time when food prices are rising and we don't expect wages to keep up. We need an economy that is fundamentally more prosperous and where that prosperity is, yes, shared by all. The increase in the national living wage announced today are actually lower than expected and leave the poorest paid workers still earning less than they need to live on. So I ask the Chancellor to adopt a real living wage level, as Labour has pledged to do, and abandon his predecessor's empty rhetoric. Regrettably, the Chancellor is still going ahead with some of the cuts to universal credit. Thanks to the pressure, and I pay tribute to those MPs on all sides of the House who've campaigned on this issue, thanks to that pressure, he's offering to soften the blow. We do not want the blow softened, we want it lifted altogether. Today's changes will leave a single parent on average at least £2,300 worse off. These are the very people who are working hard to deliver for their families, and the government is betraying them. As for the people with disabilities put through the ordeal of the discredited work capability assessment, who are trying to get themselves ready to return to work, just about managing, they still remain in the Chancellor's firing line, cutting £30 a week from the support that these disabled people receive. It is scandalous in our society. Those who are just about managing also rely upon our public services. They send their children to local schools. They depend on their local hospital. They rely on their council services like cleaning the streets, tending to their parks and playgrounds, and opening their libraries. But the reality is, after 6 wasted years, our public services are just not managing. Today, the childcare that parents rely upon remains underfunded, as the Public Accounts Committee has reported, and it will remain underfunded even after the announcements today. I want to pay tribute as well to the honourable members for Swansea East and Erith and Thamesmead for their important work in bringing the issue of child burial fees to the public attention. And I ask the government to do the right thing on child burial fees and reconsider making funding available for families in these desperate circumstances. Councillors from all political parties are reporting that they are at a tipping point in the provision of social care. The previous Chancellor cut nearly £5 billion from social care, meaning now that over 1 million people who need care aren't getting it. They're not even just about managing, and they've got little help today. We call for additional support for social care. But the funding being provided today is only a stopgap measure. Our social care system will not be secure without long-term funding. Tonight, many elderly people will remain trapped in their homes, isolated and lonely, lacking the care they need because of this continuing cuts to social care. You can't cut social care without also hitting the NHS. The supposed £10 billion funding allocated is a restatement of an earlier commitment, but the Health Select Committee described this £10 billion claim as, and I quote, misleading and incorrect. The real amount is less than half that claimed. The result? We now have 3.9 million people on NHS waiting lists, more than ever. Many of those 3.9 people are waiting in pain, and they got no relief today. No relief today. Across the country, hospitals are facing losing their accident emergency units, losing their maternity units, and losing their specialist units. This Tory government is failing patients and also failing the dedicated NHS staff that serve us so well. This is the first time healthcare spending per head has declined since the NHS was created. And I fear there will be a crisis in funding and care over this Christmas. The NHS cares for us. We should care for the NHS. On education, members of this government have also overseen the biggest real terms cuts in education for 4 decades. £1 in every 7 has been cut from FE college budgets, and Conservative policy has saddled a generation of students with a lifetime of debt. How can a government seriously talk about supporting a 21st century economy when they're planning to pour tens of millions into the failed 20th century policy of grammar schools, segregating our children at an early age? On housing, the Chancellor has announced today that he's scrapping pay-to-stay proposals and letting agents' fees. This U-turn is a victory for Labour's campaigning against both the tenant tax and letting fees. The Chancellor has spoken before of the dream of home ownership for the young. Nothing announced today is of the scale needed to suggest it will remain anything other than a dream. The hard facts are these. The government of which he was a member built fewer homes than at any point since the 1920s. There are now 1/3 fewer homeowners under 35. The Chancellor today could have delivered the scale of investment required to build the homes we need and create a new generation of home ownership. He significantly failed. I'm grateful that as a result of the campaign from the Honourable Member for Wentworth and Dean that the Wentworth and Woodhouse building will be saved. I'm grateful. The accusation was that a Labour government opened an open-cast mine near to it and threatened it. That was the Labour government, I believe, in 1947. I just wish some of the policies pursued by Tory governments since the 1950s could be reversed so easily. The biggest failure of investment is this. The Chancellor has failed to address properly this government's most consistent shortcoming. His predecessor cut public investment to the lowest it's been since the 1990s. Instead of delivering the ambitious investment this economy needs across the whole country, the Chancellor has failed to recognise the scale of the challenge today. He also risked repeating the mistakes from last year with the National Flood Resilience Plan, failing to provide the protection our communities need. Just 1 in 5 of the projects in the investment pipeline are under construction, and there are £82 billion of shovel-ready projects still delayed. The infrastructure gap between London and the rest remains unbridged. London was scheduled to receive 12 times the public investment per head of the North East of England. But the £1.1 billion of investment in transport is a re-announcement. The Oxford to Cambridge rail link is significantly delayed against Network Rail's original planned completion date of March 2019. There are just no new ideas here, just to promise to deliver what they previously failed to deliver on. This is press release policy making and not provision. And all we need now is the return of the high-vis jacket. The fourth industrial revolution will not be delivered. The fourth industrial revolution will not be delivered on delays, on old news and re-announcements. At last, the government has realised its mistake and now talk about an industrial strategy, words that ministers refused to even refer to in the past. But it isn't enough just to change a few ministerial titles. The government and the Chancellor need to deliver. But we've yet to see the proposed Green Paper on industrial strategy that was promised over the summer. The same government that now talks also up high-tech investment oversaw a £1 billion cut in real terms to science funding in the last Parliament. The OECD recommends that developed countries should be spending 3% of GDP on science. And what we've heard today, the new spending will lift our expenditure from 1.7% of GDP to a mere 1.8%. And it's the same familiar story for business. The Chancellor is continuing the race to the bottom on corporation tax. While continuing to cut the cuts to public services, the Chancellor is cutting taxes to big business. We know it's not the headline tax rates that encourage long-term investment from businesses. Business investment has been revised down every year under this government. What encourages business investment is knowing they have access to skilled workers, to world-class infrastructure and to major markets. Today's grim economic forecasts show the challenge ahead. The Chancellor admitted over the summer that it was time for a change of course. He has now had to abandon his government's fiscal charter with its failed hard surplus target. Labour warned that a hard surplus target lacks the flexibility to adapt to economic circumstances and the capacity to allow investment. The Chancellor's U-turn today demonstrates just how right we've been over this last year. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, only weeks ago, the Prime Minister offered a hope of change. The Chancellor offered to reset economic policy. Today, we've seen the very people the Prime Minister promised to champion betrayed. The Chancellor has failed to break with the economic strategy of austerity. The country remains unprepared and ill-equipped to meet the challenges of Brexit and secure Britain's future as a world-leading economy. After all the sacrifices people have made over the last 6 years, I fear today's statement has laid the foundations for more wasted years. Only a Labour government will deliver on the ambition and vision to rebuild and transform our economy so that no one and no community is left behind.
Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I first associate myself with his remarks about the Jo Cox trial and send my very deepest condolences to the family and her friends who will be suffering again today. Can I also welcome the Right Honourable Gentleman on his appointment to the Privy Council? I just wish, Mr. Speaker, I could have been there at the investiture. I remember it quite well from when I did it. They give you a little red book to hold in your hand. I've listened carefully to his response today, and his central argument appears to be that the deficit is too high and borrowing is too high. And that's a bit of a problem because, as I've understood it, his central proposal for our economy is to borrow more and spend more. Indeed, under his rule, he would always be borrowing in good times as well as bad. His analysis of the problem of the last Labour government is not that it spent too much money, but that it spent too little money. Indeed, his rule has remarkable similarities to Gordon Brown's Golden Rule, and we all know where that got us, Mr. Speaker. So his big idea is to spend an extra £500 billion without any idea of how he would pay for it. Just to respond to some of his specific comments, he welcomed the industrial strategy. Well, I'm not sure if I welcome his welcome, but I would warn him not to welcome it too quickly, because it's not going to look anything like an industrial strategy that would come out of his office. What he's heard today, Mr. Speaker, is a responsible set of decisions. Decision to borrow £23 billion of tightly targeted investment while paying for every single penny of every other commitment that has been made. He talked about Brexit, and he attacks us over the way we're handling the Brexit process. I honestly don't know whether he has ever been involved in a negotiation. I suspect not. But I'd invite him just to look across the continent for a moment. Look at the admirable discipline that our negotiating counterparts are displaying in their messaging, revealing nothing as they prepare to go into this negotiation with us. And I would advise that if we want to get the best possible deal for Britain, we have to keep our cards appropriately close to our chest. Mr. Speaker, he may have heard cuts to people's income from my announcement on universal credit, but let me explain how it works to him. When you cut the taper from 65% to 63%, you allow people to keep an extra 2% of the income that they are earning. I would have thought that he would have welcomed that. And look, this is all about making tough decisions, and I'm very happy to debate with the right honourable gentleman, but I just wish he would be honest enough to accept that you cannot shower money everywhere, proposing to spend money on everything without having to raise that money, either by taxes on ordinary people or by cutting other spending elsewhere. It's simply no good. Keep on pretending you can just do it by taxing the rich. The top 1% of people in this country already contribute 27% of income tax paid, and unfortunately there just aren't enough of them to be able to finance all the right honourable gentleman's ambitions. He said that he was disappointed by the announcement on the national living wage. I don't remember, perhaps one of my honourable friends can remind me what the level of the national living wage was during the 13 years of Labour's government. And he might note that the level I've announced today is precisely the level recommended by the Low Pay Commission, the body set up to pronounce on these things. And I wish he would also be honest when he talks about the work-related activity group in employment and support arrangements. Nobody this applies to new claims only, as he very well knows. So nobody is going to have £29 a week taken away from them, however many times he says it. And he also knows that this is not a standalone measure, it's part of a package. The money that will be saved is being reinvested in a £330 million package to get these people into work with targeted support to help them to be ready for work. He talks about house building starts. House building starts were 45% down under the last Labour government. Mr. Speaker, he and the leader of the opposition have spread division and disunity through the Labour Party, and that's exactly what they'd spread through the country if they ever, God forbid, got into government. He says there are no new ideas. I have to say, Mr. Speaker, that he needs to check the opinion polling, because that isn't quite what public opinion believes. So instead of carping and opposing every measure that we propose from this side, why doesn't he roll up his sleeves, support us in the hard work of building an economy that works for everyone?
Mr. Kenneth Clark. May I congratulate the Chancellor on reverting to the extremely sensible practice of only having one budget a year, which Gordon Brown abandoned in order to try to buy votes twice a year with disastrous consequences. May I congratulate him on easing the taper on tax credit, because it is having distorting effects on the labour market at the moment by discouraging part-time workers working extra hours, for example. And may I particularly thank him for the money that he's spent on the very, very valuable work for rehabilitating the disabled at Stamford Hall in my own constituency. But with those notable exceptions, Will he reassure me that he will resist political pressures of all kinds over the coming years to move away from the very sensible fiscal discipline he has set out, because the major risk to his period of office would come, and it would affect every section of our society, including the jams that the media have discovered, if he is unable to avoid or mitigate the risk of recession, which global uncertainty undoubtedly poses to us in the real world. And would he finally confirm that wherever he holds his cards, that he will continue inside the government, if necessary, to spell out economic reality and the long-term benefits to this country, if he wants to develop a modern competitive economy, of retaining the access to our most important market in Europe by retaining the benefits of the single market and the customs union, and that no amount of short-term political pressure should allow him to be deflected from that.
Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Oh, Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to my right honourable and learned friend, and I just say to him that while I'm delighted that we've been able to lower the taper rate in universal credit, because of course it's absolutely in line with our principle that we should be supporting and encouraging people into work. He says that the taper rate discourages people. It is of course a much lower rate of withdrawal than under the old tax credit system that it replaces. And let me reassure my right honourable friend that I and my right honourable friend the Prime Minister remain absolutely committed to the sound Tory principle that a country has to live within its means. Of course, we have to deal with the realities that the world throws at us, and that is why today I've adopted as an interim measure for the remainder of this Parliament a cyclically adjusted target, which will always allow us to respond to any downturn that occurs. But I certainly understand the importance of economic reality, and I also understand, as does my right honourable friend the Prime Minister, the extreme desirability of achieving the very best access to markets in the European for those who produce our goods and services.
Mr. Stuart Hosey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I firstly associate myself with the words from the Shadow Chancellor and the Chancellor on the late Joe Cox? Can I also thank the Chancellor for what he said about the Tay Cities deal? I note that's slightly different to the words in the Red Book, so we'll take him at face value from the dispatch box. In his attempt to clamp down on evasion, it was disappointing there was no reference made to Scottish limited partnerships. Yep. And in terms of fairness overall, one would have thought there would have been more than or any reference to the WASPI campaign and the unfairness for those women. However, the Chancellor did give us plenty of information today, but with no more than a kind of glib reference to being match fit at the beginning and a bit of deflection. Very little actually on the elephant in the room, which is Brexit. And it's not as if the Treasury don't know what the consequences will be. Their own assessment tells us that tax yield could be down 66 billion a year after 15 years, GDP down perhaps 9.5%, a figure confirmed by the LSE as a result of reduced trade, reducing productivity. That amounts to some £6,500 per year per household. So where was the plan to ensure there was no hard Brexit, to maintain access to the single market? Where was the plan to mitigate the loss in tax yield and GDP? And although he said a considerable amount, and I welcome some of it up to a point, about capital investment and research and development, where was the fully developed plan to actually boost productivity? You see, Mr. Speaker, we don't go into this next period from a position of strength. UK GDP, as the Chancellor knows, is already approaching being 20% lower than it would have been if we'd achieved even a 2% trend growth rate since 2008. And our argument is the austerity of this and the previous government sucked consumption out of the economy, weakening recovery. It is an error I fear they're set to repeat again. Growth barely reaches 2% for the forecast period, and although he sensibly didn't put a date on it, the Chancellor is still targeting a surplus in the economy, perhaps again before recovery has been secured. May I say a few words about the fiscal charter? I'm glad he's changed it, because the previous permanent surplus rule, taking $10 billion a year out more than was required to run a balanced economy, cutting $50 billion a year more than was required to run a balanced current budget, left us with some terrible consequences. They were as discretionary consolidation, tax rises and cuts took place. The ratio of cuts to tax rises also increased. It placed the burden of austerity and an arbitrary fiscal target on the back of the poor. It's made the lowest decile 5% worse off and the richest 10% almost entirely all better off. So the government has clearly worked something out, and I do welcome move on the taper. But let's be clear, at 2 pence in the pound on the minimum wage, it's 14 pence an hour. It's not a king's ransom. It will not cure poverty. The squeeze has not been lifted from the poor. The screw of the welfare cap has not been turned off. This has simply made a brutal regime slightly less brutal. However, I'm glad he mentioned the actions of the Bank of England. Our party very much welcome what the Governor has done. An increase in QE, 60 billion of extra government bond purchases, 10 billion available for corporate bond purchases, 0.25% base rate, additional term funding to make more and cheaper lending from the banks. However, there's been an almost complete absence of a fiscal policy stimulus in order to match the incredible monetary policy activism of the central bank. So the key aspect of today's autumn statement, and I'm also pleased it's the last one, given this is now my 25th budget autumn statement or pre-budget statement. The key part of today's autumn statement was the increase in total managed expenditure. But over the 15-16, 2021 forecast period, like for like, it amounts to 1.5% of total managed expenditure. It is to be welcome. It's certainly a break from the recent past, but it can be in no way described as the sort of fiscal stimulus required to match the monetary policy discipline of the central bank. So the two other aspects he talked about was an increase in capital investment. I very much welcome that, and the increase in research and development. But given the research and development description has changed in the Green Book, as has the description of the UK TI funding, and he said there would be a doubling of some aspects of export support, it's hard to tell precisely what the impact of some of those measures are. So I hope he can tell us, in total, what is the increase in cash terms and in percentage terms of export support absolutely vital. What is, again, the overall increase in research and development across the piece? And how does he intend to see deployed the £23 billion he described in terms of capital investment?
The Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure. I might have to consult my honourable and right honourable friends. I'm not sure if that was a thank you or not. I think it might have been. What I'd say, no, it wasn't. It wasn't. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, what we have announced today is a significant increase in capital investment, and capital investment includes research and development under the ONS definition. Scotland will get £800 million of that. R&D, of course, is not Barnetised. R&D will be spread across the whole of the UK, but the infrastructure element will be Barnetised, and Scotland will get £800 million. But I just say this to the honourable gentleman. Scotland's economic performance also needs attention. Scotland's productivity also needs addressing. And I very much hope, and I'm sure that families and businesses across Scotland will very much hope that he can confirm, or one of his colleagues can confirm, that the Scottish Government will use this additional funding in the spirit that it is being raised for the rest of the United Kingdom to invest in raising the productivity performance of the Scottish economy. I would very much welcome that. He asked about the detailed productivity message. I can assure him there is no lack of enthusiasm in this government for tackling the productivity challenge. My right honourable friend, the Business Secretary, the Treasury and other departments are involved in a process which will lead to a green paper allowing us to consult extensively with business and other outside bodies before we firm up exactly how to deliver the strategy. But what the House has seen today is £23 billion of additional investment, alongside £150 billion already committed to investment in economic infrastructure over the period, that will form the backbone for that policy and its delivery. And I just say to the honourable gentleman this, and he knows this very well, he probably wouldn't admit it, but he knows it very well. The biggest drag on growth in Scotland, survey after survey shows, the biggest drag on business investment is the continuing threat of a second referendum. Bigger than, well, he needs to go back and look at the polling data. Bigger than concerns about possible future Brexit arrangements is the concern about a second Scottish independence referendum. And I just say this to him in response to his specific points. I will be publishing a distributional analysis. I believe it's available in the Vote Office now, of the measures that have been announced today, and cumulatively of the measures that have been announced throughout this Parliament. It will not show the outcome that the honourable gentleman suggested. So perhaps he'd like to look at that, and then we can no doubt have another exchange on this at Treasury Questions. The overall package of measures today represents a fiscal loosening of around £23 billion. I acknowledge that that is a reduction of a planned fiscal tightening, but of course there has to be a fiscal tightening over time, because we are moving to living within our means with a balanced budget in the next Parliament, and we are not going to be deflected from that intention. Finally, just to clear up the confusion, UKTI the budget of UKTI is now rolled into the budget of the Department for International Trade. What I announced in my statement was that the capacity of, that is the risk capacity of UK export finance, will be doubled so that it can provide finance for exporters from all over the UK to sell their goods abroad on credit.
George Osborne.
Can I warmly congratulate my friend and successor on a strong statement and an assured delivery. Can I particularly welcome the additional support for the Northern Powerhouse? The Independent Office for Budget Responsibility has given us a very sober assessment of the economic and borrowing challenges that Britain faces, and the Chancellor is right to keep his powder dry, but he's also right to adhere to the principles that we control current spending, that we make sure that work pays and make the welfare and tax reforms necessary to deliver that, that we make Britain the best place to attract business, and we have the freest possible trade with our key export markets, and I support all the things he's doing to deliver on those principles.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm extremely grateful to my right honourable friend, and he's absolutely right. The principles that he set out will guide the actions of this government, as they should guide the actions of any sensible government, as we try to future-proof our economy in a time of extraordinary change, not only political change but technological change. We are facing a period of 20 or 30 years in which the way we work, the way we live, the way we do business will change fundamentally, and unless we invest now in our infrastructure, in our science and technology base, in our innovation capability, we risk being left behind, and that will not deliver the economy and the country that works for everyone that we are committed to.
Ed Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, can I welcome the fact that the Chancellor of the Exchequer has adopted fiscal rules that his predecessor described as the single biggest risk to economic recovery, the ones we proposed in 2015. But I want to ask him about Brexit, because he said at the Tory party conference that the British people did not vote to become poorer. The OBR tells us on page 19, Mr. Speaker, that £58 billion of the worsening in the public finances is due to the Brexit decision. Isn't this a salutary warning to us about the decisions we take in the coming months and years? And isn't it a very strong argument for us remaining as close as possible to our largest trading area, the single market, and inside, not outside, the customs union?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as the Prime Minister has said many times, and I'm very happy to repeat, and I've no doubt I shall be repeating many times today, it remains our objective to try to get the closest possible trading arrangement that we can with the European Union, the greatest access that we can for our goods and services to be sold into European markets after we leave the European Union. But the effect that I think we have to disaggregate two effects. There is, of course, going to be a period of uncertainty as we go through the process of exiting the European Union, and that has, as the OBR has identified, had a dampening effect on business investment. But we have also to rise to the challenge of getting ourselves match fit to seize the opportunities that this country will have after we complete that process. And I would urge him to think about that longer-term challenge as well as the short-term issues.
Can I congratulate the Chancellor on delivering a crucial statement for the country? It was a budget in all but name, and I strongly support his decision to make it the first of many autumn budgets, something that a number of us on the Treasury Committee have been pressing for a while. The statement will provide reassurance and certainty for the whole country. Given that the education sector creates export earnings of £20 billion, that's about the same as the car manufacturing sector, will the Chancellor soon be able to provide our colleges and universities with the certainty and reassurance they need that foreign students will not be caught by the 100,000 migration target?
Well, Mr. Speaker, first of all, I'm grateful to the Chairman of the Treasury Select Committee for his remarks and indeed for the committee's work on single fiscal event. It's very much appreciated, and I do think it's the right way for us to go. On the specific question that he's asked, as he knows, students are included within the 100,000 or the tens of thousands target, and I know that my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, is looking at how best to manage student flows in the interests of what, as he says, is a very important industry in this country.
Mr. Chris Leslie.
Mr. Speaker, a few months ago, the Foreign Secretary promised the general public that by now we would have an extra £350 million a week for the National Health Service. Yet, strangely, since the referendum, he's just announced growth falling, business investment collapsing, an extra £110 billion of borrowing over the forecast period when compared with March. And I don't see any of his Leave colleague campaigners on the front bench. Has he received an apology yet from the Foreign Secretary or any of them?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not responsible for remarks that may or may not have been made during political campaigns. What I will say to him is that the British people have made a decision to leave the European Union. We must respect that decision. If we are going to make a success of this process, if we are going to ensure the success of the British economy in the future, we have to move on from keep having this sterile debate over and over again. We have to focus our attention on building an economy that is match fit for the future and that will enable us to deliver high living standards as we make our way in the world.
Mr. John Redwood.
Someone who is much more optimistic about the prospects for the UK economy under the Chancellor's stewardship than the OBR usually are, may I welcome very much the increased OBR forecast for this year, a faster rate of growth now than there was pre the vote, and may I welcome their recognition there will be no winter recession post the vote in the way some forecast. But will he agree with me that the OBR are probably still quite wrong about 2017. Their forecast is too low, their borrowing forecast far too high, and we will get good access to the single market once we're out of the EU.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I very much hope on the last point that my right honourable friend is right, and that will, of course, be our objective. And I'm grateful to him for his implicit confidence in my stewardship. But look, Mr. Speaker, I have to, and I'm well aware of my right honourable friend's views. They are, as always, long-standing and utterly consistent. But it is not my job to opine on the report that the OBR has made by statute to Parliament. It is my job to respond to it, and that is what I have done today. Obviously, economic forecasting is not a precise science, and I absolutely recognise, as would the OBR, that individual members will have their own views on the likely future trajectory of our economy. It's probably worth mentioning that the OBR very specifically says in its report that there is an unusually high degree of uncertainty in the forecasts that it's making because of the unusual circumstances.
Meg Hillier.
Mr. Speaker, in a long statement, we heard no mention of the National Health Service. And in the first 6 months so far this year, the deficit is 648 million for trusts alone, with a year-end deficit forecast of 669 million. Given the extraordinary measures the Department of Health had to go to balance its budget in the last financial year, and given those projections, what is the Chancellor doing to make sure there's a sustainable future for our National Health Service?
Well, I say to the Honourable Lady, I might be a novice at autumn statements, but I'm not such a rookie that I didn't mention the NHS, so I suggest she checks the Hansard. She'll find that I very definitely did. And look, she talks about a projected trust deficit, aggregate trust deficit of £648 million projected at a point which is 4 months out from the end of the fiscal year. This is in the context of a budget of £110 billion in an NHS that holds a contingency reserve at the centre. And my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, is well aware of these pressures. They're not particularly unusual. They are being managed inside the NHS, and of course I am keeping and will continue to keep a very close eye on them with my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary.
Anna Soubry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate my right honourable friend on a wide range of measures, short-term, medium and long-term, which will undoubtedly turbocharge our economy and give it the boost it needs as we face the realities of Brexit. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that it's never been more important for British business to be at the very heart of local enterprise partnerships, great ideas like the Midland Engine, and indeed all those infrastructure plans? And it's not to be driven by politicians, but these sorts of projects must be driven by British business.
Well, I absolutely agree with my honourable friend, and I'm grateful for her comments. It isn't just that we need business to be engaged at the heart of this process, and I passionately believe that is the right way to do it, and local enterprise partnerships are a good innovation for delivering that, as well as the area-specific project organisations. But this is also part of meeting the challenge of regional imbalance, which, as I said earlier, isn't just a social problem, it's an economic problem. And when we look at our productivity gap with other advanced economies, we should look, logically, for the things that are different in our country to those comparators. And the gap between our capital city and our other cities and regions is one of the defining features of the UK economy. And by working with businesses across the country and in the UK regions, particularly by promoting our regional cities, we can start at last to address this problem.
Randy Burnham.
The north of England is crying out for a plan for investment in rail, and people will be left asking today, where is it? But it is also crying out for investment in social care. And quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, it is unbelievable that the Chancellor could find no mention for it today. 6 years of cuts to social care have left a record number of older people trapped in hospital and the NHS on the brink, with a dangerous winter now facing us. Can the Chancellor say a little more about how he came to the judgment that new grammar schools is a higher spending priority than the funding of the care of older people?
Well, I'm a little bit surprised at the right honourable gentleman, as a former Chief Secretary, not actually being able to distinguish between capital and resource, because of course the funding that we're talking about for grammar schools is capital spending. I said in the course of my statement that the Department for Transport will continue the discussions on Northern Powerhouse Rail with Transport for the North and make announcements in due course. He asked me specifically about social care, and of course right honourable members opposite are very fond of talking about cuts to social care budgets. Local authorities have to manage their budgets as they think best. They have to manage the envelope of resource that they're given. And what we've done, Mr. Speaker, is created a Better Care Fund that by the end of this Parliament will be delivering £1.5 billion a year into social care. We have allowed local authorities to raise a social care precept, which by the end of this Parliament will be delivering another £2 billion a year. That's £3.5 billion a year of additional funding into the social care system. Now, what I would say to the honourable gentleman is this, what I would accept is this. There is an issue that local authorities are raising, and we've heard what they are saying, about the profiling, about how they how this large amount of additional money ramps up. And that's an issue that my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, my right honourable friend, the Communities Secretary, are extremely aware of and are discussing with them.
Dr. Sarah Wollaston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Care Quality Commission has warned that social care is at a tipping point, and vulnerable people across the country are being left without the care and support that they need, and this is adding hugely to the costs for the NHS. I was disappointed to see that the Better Care Fund hasn't been brought forward yet, but I'm encouraged to hear that that is actively under discussion. But I wonder, could the Chancellor confirm